the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
Welcome to part 2 of the podcast on Wilfred Rhodes with his biographer Patrick Ferriday. My name is Tom Ford. Be sure to listen to part 1, focusing on Wilfred's early life in Yorkshire, his bowling technique and relationship with the cricket hierarchy. One of the most famous episodes involving Wilfred was the Test match against Australia in 1902 at the Oval, a match which is known today as Jessop's match because of Gilbert Jessop's blistering century in 76 bowls in the final innings. With 1 wicket remaining and 15 runs to win, England batsman George Hurst and Wilfred Rhodes successfully chased down the target. Hurst has long been credited with saying to Rhodes, "We'll get 'em in singles, Wilfred." Once and for all, Patrick, did this exchange actually happen?
Once and for all, it didn't.
Right.
Whatever I say, it'll carry on being said that that's what was. I've got it from George Hurst said it was never said. In fact, I'm opening the page on the book. Wilfred, I think, said, well, of course he didn't say that. It would have been daft because if you can hit the ball for 4, then you're going to.
Yes, makes sense.
Also, the little thing is they didn't get them in singles. The scoring record will show that they didn't get them in singles. There was a 4 in their partnership and a couple of 2s. It was, I think Wilfred said it was some pressman's invention. And I did find a poem from the period, because I'm now looking at the book and I'm going to quote from it. So I've put the question: where did this myth originate? You'll see I'm already calling it a myth. There was a poem written at the time which says, 15 to win as Rhodes strode to the wicket. Said George Hurst, come do as they're bid. Let's get him in singles, safe cricket, and get them. They certainly did. Well, yeah. Okay, I mean that may be the that may be where it comes from. It didn't happen, but I'm going to quote something else because this is one of my favourites in the whole book. Really, it was a chap called A.C. Denham asked the pair of them about what had happened on that famous day. And A.C. Denham reports that, well, I'll quote him. I asked George if he was nervous at the Oval. Nervous? No, I can't say that I was nervous. But now you come to mention it, I remember I was a bit afraid lest the occasion might be too big for Wilfred. And then Denham posed the same question to Wilfred. Wilfred replied, nervous? No, I wasn't nervous. Not exactly what you might call nervous. But I must say, I did feel anxious lest George get out.
Yeah. Good answer.
Yeah, it's a complete myth, and I've no doubt that myth will continue forevermore. But it is a myth, and it's not true.
It's probably why cricket reporting today doesn't take the form of poetry.
Yeah,
for good reason.
Yeah.
What's remarkable? I mean, there are many remarkable things about Wilfred's career, but possibly the most remarkable thing is that at some point he transitioned from an internationally successful spin bowler into a record-breaking Test opening batsman. How does a regular number 11, such as Wilfred, suddenly emerge as a successful opening batsman?
He was always pretty good with a bat. Even in his first season, he would get 20s and 30s batting at 11. As you probably know, on his first tour of Australia, he was still batting at 11. But he and Ari Foster set the record 10th wicket partnership for England. I think Wilfred got 40 or 50 not out, supporting Foster. He was pretty handy with a bat. He really enjoyed batting. I mean, he said that himself. He kind of preferred batting to bowling. I think by 1905, 1906, he was up to sort of number 6 in the Yorkshire order, but he was still their premier bowler. But within a couple of years, because of various retirements and so forth, Yorkshire didn't have an opening batsman, but they still did have a good bowling attack. And Wilfred basically put himself forward and said, I can be an opening bat and I can still bowl if you need me. And he went to the top of the order for Yorkshire, became their opening batsman. He wasn't Stanley Jackson or Fry, or he was he could score fast runs when he needed to, but he was very, very effective. I don't think he was one of the prettiest batsmen ever to play the game. But he was very, very effective, and he was so effective that England came calling. They didn't have a partner for Jack Hobbs, and as soon as Rhodes started opening the batting for England, which I think the first time he did it was on a tour of South Africa in 1909, 10, 8, 9, around then anyway. And he was put together with Jack Hobbs, and they put on 200 in 2 successive matches, I think it was. And also what the two of them had was a remarkable understanding of running between the wickets. A real complete trust in one another's judgment. And it drove certainly in that series, drove the South Africans absolutely mad. And drove them to distraction, this kind of running without calling, just quick singles left, right and centre, which were based on the pair of them being obviously quick between the wickets, but complete trust of one another. If one went, the other went. No questions asked. And once that partnership had been established, well, apart from Wilfred being very successful himself, anybody who was going to support Jack Hobbs and was going to be Jack Hobbs' favoured partner, you would be very inclined to do what Jack Hobbs wanted, because he was so much, at that stage, the best batsman in the world. I think Victor Trumper was slightly in decline by then. So, yeah, Hobbs was certainly the best batsman in the world. And Rhodes was the perfect foil for him. I think going back to what I was referring to earlier about his career, about his financial security, I think he saw that it was more likely that even if he lost his spinning finger or his ability to spin or whatever, then he could make a decent living as a batsman. Plus, he did like being on the field. He did like being involved in everything. Yeah. I think possibly being an opening batsman taught him stuff about what other bowlers do. And he will have learned from that. I just think Wilfred learned from everything. Absolutely everything. But he did enjoy it as well. But certainly he was doing, to some degree, what the county needed. He became that batsman because the county needed an opening bat. And then you could go on to after the First World War, when the county had good batting and their bowling was weak, and he went back to his bowling.
Now, you mentioned Jack Hobbs in that answer. History largely associates Jack Hobbs with his great partner, Herbert Sutcliffe. But prior to the First World War, as you just touched on, I think for about 6 seasons, his Test opening partner was Wilfred Rhodes. And I think you make the point, very excellent point in your book, that statistically the Rhodes partnership was just as good, if not better, than the Sutcliffe partnership. Why do you think history has largely forgotten this?
Well, I think the Hobbs-Sutcliffe partnership does have more redolence in the sense that it was more equal. I think you could certainly say that, ridiculously enough, that Hobbs said it himself, so it's not ridiculous. He wasn't the batsman after the First World War that he was before the First World War. Having said that, he did score about 45,000 runs after the First World War and was opening England's batting for 10 years. So God knows what he was like before the First World War. But he was a much more attacking batsman before the First War. He wasn't Trumper, but he wasn't far off. And after the First War, he became more sedate, let's say. And he and Sutcliffe really were almost equals, I would say, during the 20s. The greatest innings, I think, of the 20s came from Sutcliffe rather than Hobbs. Hobbs was probably was the better batsman, but Sutcliffe was brilliant in his own way. Hobbs, Rhodes would never have claimed to any brilliance. I think he was the supporter, he was the foil for Hobbs, but he could get centuries and big centuries too, as he did in that South African series I mentioned. Then later the Australian series of 1911-12, where Hobbs and Rhodes broke the record for the first wicket partnership. Then in the triangular series in England in 1912. I don't know. Yeah, Hobbs and Sutcliffe, they are just names that go together somehow as the greatest opening partnership maybe that England have ever had. Sutcliffe did average, 55 in tests or something like that. I mean, he was a great batsman in his own right. And if you're talking about opening pairs, you like both of them to be good.
Yeah.
And Wilfred was good, but he certainly wasn't in anything like the class of Hobbs. And he knew it, and he said it.
Inscribed shall be each name in letters bold of brightest gold on the nation's scroll of fame.
Patrick, there's a line in your book which is seemingly a throwaway line, but in all my years of reading cricket literature, it really made me sit up and think, and that is about cricketers of the golden age, and we're talking about Wilfred's first tour to Australia in 1903-04, didn't wear sunglasses. It's such an innocuous statement, but it's actually quite profound. For a cricketer such as Wilfred, coming from an overcast part of England, it must have been quite a shock to the system to be spending hour after hour under the blistering Australian sun. Do you think this may have affected Wilfred's blindness? We know he spent the last few decades of his life blind. Do you think this may have affected it?
I think that's a theory that's been posited before. I'm not an expert on glaucoma, and it was untreated glaucoma that did cause his blindness. I wouldn't have thought so. There were lots of other cricketers went over to Australia. I mean, Wilfred did go 4 times. But I mean, if that's the case, then wouldn't that have applied to Australian players who played there all the time and didn't wear sunglasses? Or maybe they grew up more accustomed to it, so possibly it wouldn't have affected them as badly. I know Wilfred did talk about the glare and the heaviness of the air, which going back to when we were talking about his bowling, he did change his bowling for the Australian series of 03-04. He just said, I realised I needed to bowl a bit quicker. And he never really was able, he said, he was never really able to get back to his English style after that Australian tour. He found that somehow became implanted in him, and he did bowl a bit quicker, and he thought that took away from his skill as a spin bowler very slightly. I can't say in terms of his eye condition that wasn't a factor. Personally, I think it's unlikely, but I'm not an eye doctor.
Tell us about Wilfred's domestic life. In his various correspondence and interviews, does he mention his wife Sarah or give any insight into his world outside of cricket?
No.
Wow.
Is the short answer to that. No, he was very, very private. Barely mentions his wife. I think she comes into it once or twice. They had one daughter, Margaret, Garton's mother, who was a wonder. He absolutely doted on his daughter, and she was a profound influence. Well, she and her mother, Wilfred's wife, were profound influences on his career, but he didn't talk about them. He did consent to have his photograph taken with them a couple of times. I think on their wedding their 25th wedding anniversary, there are a couple of photos of them together, and then on his 50th birthday, there's a family group. But by and large, no, he wasn't really interested in the press. He wasn't. He recognised that interviews were necessary, and these were the days where he would come back from, I don't know, for example, I've got one where he comes back from a tour of Australia, arrives home at 3 a.m, having got the night train from London, and there's a couple of Yorkshire Post journalists knocking on his door at 9 o'clock in the morning, asking how things went, and I think he was pretty polite. He was pretty polite as long as they knew their stuff. What he struggled with, I think, were people asking him about cricket who didn't really know about cricket. He could get a bit gruff and bad-tempered with them. But yeah, his domestic life, I mean, his wife, Sarah, was a huge support to him. If you think about just the travails of an English cricket season where he was probably out on the road quite often from Monday to Saturday, come home on Saturday night maybe, dump a load of dirty washing, have a nice roast, have a decent kip, and then off again on Monday morning. And that would go on from end of April to middle of September. And then possibly, well, as was the case in many winters, then he'd be off again in mid-November to Australia, South Africa, and then latterly India. Yeah, a really tough life for his wife. He would have to sort out, for example, finances, that if he went on a tour to Australia or South Africa, he had to make sure that she had enough money for the winter, because he wouldn't be paid till the end of the tour.
That's interesting.
So, just little things like that. I think once they got to the 1920s, I think her life was a lot easier. He was earning more money, and her daughter was at home as well, so she wasn't so on her own. But in going back to your original question, he talked very, very little about it. I think he quite simply thought, this is nobody's business but mine.
While this podcast is, of course, concentrated on cricketers from the Golden Age, that is, those prior to the First World War, Wilfred's career continued for 13 more seasons after the war ended. In short, how did Wilfred's cricket change after the war, and how significant were his contributions on the international stage?
Well, once cricket restarted, I think we mentioned this earlier, there was certainly a lack of talent in English cricket. I mean, they'd had a 4-year hiatus. Some cricketers didn't come back at all. A lot of cricketers were not the same as they had been before the First War. I mean, any number of it. George Hurst, for example, was not the player in 1919 that he had been in 1914. Not surprisingly, he was older than Wilfred. And Wilfred basically, as I said earlier, he went back to bowling because Yorkshire needed bowlers, not batsmen. And he picked up his spin bowling again and proceeded. I think he topped the averages, in 1920, 21, 22, 23, and 24. I think 5 years in a row he topped the English averages. So, for a man who was now in his early 40s, he was the best spin bowler in the country by that measure. I think by any measure, actually. In terms of international, and incidentally, Yorkshire won 4 championships in a row, which had a lot to do with his bowling. In terms of international cricket, he went to Australia for the first tour after the First War, 1920-21. He didn't do well. They didn't really. I don't think I don't think Johnny Douglas, the captain, quite knew what to do with him. He wasn't an opening batsman anymore. He didn't spin the ball enough. He'd certainly lost some of his bowling ability, and I think what Rhodes said is basically I could knock people over in English cricket. I had the conditions that suited me, but also there were a lot of bad batsmen around. When he got to Australia, the conditions weren't right, and there were a lot of good batsmen around. The tour was a bit of a disaster. Well, it was a disaster for the whole team. I mean, as you know, Australia completely thumped England 5-0. And Wilfred didn't do particularly well, but nor did anybody else, except I seem to remember Jack Hobbs did do pretty well, but nobody else did. And then there was which feeds into what came later. There was an incident when they were coming back that the manager of the team was a man called Frederick Toone, who was also a bigwig in Yorkshire cricket. He said Wilfred's finished. He said this to another Yorkshire player, which was a little bit inappropriate and quite stupid. And it was reported back to Wilfred. And I think probably Wilfred would have thought, I'll show him. But in terms of international cricket, yeah, that was perceived to be the end. And he wasn't considered for selection. And as far as I remember, he pretty much said, I'm carrying on for Yorkshire now. Yorkshire's where I'm going to play cricket. 5-day tests or test cricket is not for the likes of me. It's a young man's game, young man and Jack Hobbs's game. He did come back to test cricket. You've referred to going on the West Indies tour, but he did come back another time for the last, you know this, but maybe some of your listeners don't. He came back for one test in the 1926 Ashes series. It was quite a big test because after 4 tests, the score was 0-0. So this was the deciding test. It was going to be played to a finish because it was a deciding test. That was the MCC rules, that if they were level pegging after 4 tests, so they would play to a finish. And England had tried a number of spinners over the summer, Roy Kilner particularly. They summoned Wilfred. Wilfred was a selector. He was one of 2 professional players who'd been co-opted onto the selection committee, he and Jack Hobbs. And Wilfred went down to the selection meeting. Interestingly enough, it was during the general strike, so he had to drive down to London. He drove from his Yorkshire home. He stopped in Leicester, where his daughter lived, and his wife was in Leicester as well. And they both spoke to him as he stopped overnight and said, they are going to ask you to play. And Wilfred said, yeah, I've got a feeling they are. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. But I don't really want to because I'm worried I'll let everybody else down. I'm 46 now or something. My fielding's not very good. And But he got down to the selection meeting, and of course they did ask him to play and said, you're still the best spinner in the country, and he acquiesced and agreed to play. And play he did, and England were lucky with the weather. Things worked out pretty well for them. And the crucial element, really, of the game, I suppose, was an amazing opening partnership of Hobbs and Sutcliffe, who we referred to earlier, putting on 200 on a wet wicket, which was quite a remarkable achievement. But Wilfred did bowl, and didn't he just bowl? He got... Now I'm going to have to go back to what his figures were, and I'm going to insist on reading a quote. He took 2 for 35 off 25 overs in the first innings, and the 2 batsmen he got out were Woodfull and Richardson, which is not a bad pair. And then in the second innings, he took 4 for 44, and he got out Bardsley, Ponsford, Collins, and Richardson. So he got some decent players out.
Yeah.
And England went on for this famous, I suppose any Ashes triumph is famous, But this one particularly was, because it was the first one after the First World War. It had huge redolence over the country. I mean, I would certainly say there was probably no test match that had ever been weighted with such anticipation throughout the country. It was in coming in the summer of a general strike. It was an escapism, and there was this feeling of England cricket is finally getting back on its feet and not being bashed around by the dirty Aussies and all this kind of business. And they did it. And Hobbs and Sutcliffe particularly, but also Larwood and the great Wilfred. I call him the great Wilfred. I can't help myself. Sorry.
That's fine.
But I will. There's just one quote I would like to read, and this was from. It's a quote from Harold Larwood, and he was interviewed by a wonderful journalist called Frank Keating. And Keating asked Larwood about this final test match. And this is what Larwood had to say. He just said, "Rhodes was pure genius. I got Woodfull for a duck, and after a bit, Rhodes came on." Now, when he came on, this is me interjecting, when he came on, Bill Ponsford was batting. Now, for anybody who doesn't know about Bill Ponsford, he's very much known as the obdurate run machine. Less so than Bradman, but he was also his most famous vicious shot was his square cut. This is going back to Larwood. That Ponsford was a vicious cutter of the ball. Vicious. I was at point, but Rhodes keeps signalling me closer to the bat, still fetching me up till I'm almost standing on Ponsford's crease. Sure, I'm a bit scared. Rhodes comes up, just 2 paces from behind the umpire, but he stops dead and stares at me. I'd involuntarily taken a pace back from Ponsford's crease. He fetches me in again. First ball nips through and smacks into Strudwick's gloves. Second ball breaks back and Ponsford, surprised, pops it up and I jump across and catch it left-handed. Rhodes walks down the pitch to me and says softly, "You can go back a bit now, Sonny. We got him."
Brilliant.
I just love the idea of Harold Larwood being told to stand 1.5 yards from Ponsford's bat, and Wilfred knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah.
And then, "You can go back now, Sonny. We got him."
I love it. Great story.
Gorgeous. Anyway, I digress. Yes, then he went to the West Indies in 1930. A lot of the first-rate players were resting for the following summer's Ashes. So it was a bit of a kind of mix and match team. Very much an MCC where we can roll over the West Indies anyway, even with only a few first teamers and then some old crocs. Wilfred he took a fair few wickets. He got George Headley out, which isn't a bad notch. And he bowled more than anybody else, even though he was 52 by this time. He bowled more overs than anybody else on the tour. I think the bit I love most about it, the West Indies were selecting a team to tour Australia the following Australian summer, and they asked for Wilfred's advice on all the players he'd seen, who they should take to Australia, which I think is says something about what they thought about him. An educated cricketer in the world, and he'd played against all the West Indians that on that tour, and they wanted to know what he thought.
Now, Patrick, cricket history is a beautiful mix of storytelling and statistics or numbers. So let's have a look at Wilfred's statistics through his career. And of course, I mean, we've touched on them already, but there's quite a few numbers to go through. So as we've mentioned, he started his test career in 1899, which was the first Ashes test at Nottingham, which turned out to be, no one knew at the time, but turned out to be W.G. Grace's final test. And there's a beautiful team photo during that match with, of course, Grace front and centre or in the middle, and young Wilfred sitting at his feet. And he plays right through until 1930. He plays his final test against the West Indies in Kingston. First class career ends with that match. It began in 1898. When we look at his batting, and this is where the numbers get really interesting. So we'll look at his batting numbers first. He played 58 tests, batted 98 times, scored 2,325 runs. His highest score was 179, which was part of that huge partnership with Jack Hobbs in Melbourne in 1912. Has a batting average of 30.19, 2 centuries to his name and 11 50s. His first class batting record, so there's that famous number 1,110 matches. You mentioned at the top of the podcast that he fronted up 1,534 times, which I think is a record. And he scored 39,969 runs, so just short of 40,000. Highest score of 267 not out. His batting average is remarkably similar in test and first class. So his first class batting average is 30.81, and he scored 58 first class centuries. Certainly nothing to sneeze at, and 197 50s. Obviously, with Wilfred, we have to talk about the bowling as well. And this is where the numbers are quite staggering. So 4,204 wickets. He bowled 185,742 deliveries and gave away 70,322 runs. Best first class bowling figures, 9 for 24. That itself is remarkable. In Test cricket, best bowling figures were 8 for 68, and for a match, 15 for 124. In first class cricket, he took 5 wickets 287 times. And I mean, they're just numbers we don't see today. And he took 10 wickets matches and 68 occasions. I've written down just some of the more remarkable feats. So we've mentioned the big numbers, of course, but 23 times he took 100 wickets in a first-class season, which is a record. 16 times, you mentioned this earlier, he did the double, which is 100 wickets or more in a season and 1,000 runs as a batsman in a single season. He did that 16 times. George Hurst is next with 14. These numbers are just so, I think to a modern listener, are just incomprehensible. As much as these figures are now what we think are concrete, they're not always the same. Is that right, Patrick? There's some conjecture relating to the number of first-class matches and wickets that he took?
I think those numbers you've quoted are now set in stone, but that does lead me into I always grew up, which makes me rather a sad child at the age of 9, being very well aware of Wilfred Rhodes taking 4,187 wickets in first class cricket. And this, like lots of kids, this kind of number was imprinted on my brain, same as 365 is imprinted on my brain. You'll know if you grew up you didn't, but I did. If you grew up in the 70s, 365 had a certain redolence. 99 point, whatever it was for Bradman, 99.6 But Wilfred's was 4,187 for the wickets. Now, somewhere in the 1990s, there were various discussions about a couple of games that he played in India. He went to India 4 times in various winters as a paid employee of the Maharaja of Patiala, as a coach and player. And a couple of games in India had been credited to his record, but a couple hadn't. And various luminaries of statistics looked into these games. And in fact, 2 of the games that hadn't been credited to him were actually first-class games. And so 17 wickets were added to his already staggering totals. So he went up from 4,187 to 4,204. And I mean, I have to say, it just made me laugh because I just thought, good old Wilfred, he's taking wickets even after he's died. Yeah. I mean, that's good going.
Absolutely. His best bowling figures, as I mentioned, 15 for 124 for the match and 8 for 68 for an innings, actually occurred in the same match, as you would expect. The second test match of the 1903-04 tour at the Melbourne Cricket Ground. What can you tell us about this match?
Oh, you're really leading me on here. Well, I could tell you more than you want to know about that match, but thank you anyway for leading me into. I think if you're interested in Wilfred, but you want a kind of very, very digested account of his career, very digested, that you could boil down to 2 matches, I think you could look at the first 2 tests of that tour, the 1903-04 tour, and I hope I'm getting them the right way round. The one you've referred to there, where he got 15 wickets, I think you said. That was played on a very wet wicket. And yeah, I mean, obviously you can tell by the figures, he skittled Australia twice, pretty much single-handedly, but it was a perfect wicket for him. Wilfred himself thought he didn't bowl particularly well, but actually he did point out, and it's been backed up by a number of other accounts, there were an astonishing amount of drop catches in that game. I think somebody counted it as 12 easy catches were dropped, let alone difficult ones, of which 8 were off his bowling.
Wow.
So goodness only knows what his figures would have been. I think Pelham Warner tried to figure out why everybody was dropping catches, and he couldn't. He talked about the tree line round the ground, or maybe something. So his figures would have been considerably better if everybody caught their catches. But his figures were pretty good, and he totally rolled over Australia twice under perfect conditions. But if you go back to the match before, which was played on a perfect wicket, the first test match of the series, which was also Wilfred's first test match in Australia, following all the dire predictions about how much he'd struggle. The second test match, the one I'd referred to there, where he got the 15 wickets, that was at Melbourne. The first test was at Sydney. Now, the Sydney test was played on an absolutely perfect wicket. Wilfred's figures in the second innings were 5 for 94 and an Australian total of 485. Now, Wilfred considered that to be his best bowling performance, probably of his whole career.
Wow.
He said it was absolutely the most perfect pitch. The fact that Australia scored 485 and Wilfred got 5 for 94 is a fair indication. He bowled 40 overs, 48 ball overs they would have been. And then there's the famous story, which I think is actually true. I think I've got it from 2 or 3 sources, that Victor Trumper, who scored 185 on this wicket, Victor Trumper actually just called down to the pitch, "Can't you just give me a moment's peace, Wilfred?" Sorry, I can't do the accent. Trumper was just belting every other bowler around the ground, and he just couldn't belt Wilfred. And Wilfred felt all the time that he could get Trumper out. He didn't in the end, but he kept him quiet and he got 5 for 94. And England went on to win the game by 5 wickets. Pretty much, again, his contribution to that victory was pretty much as important as his contribution to the other one, where he got 15 wickets. Because if he hadn't got the 15, probably Braund or whoever else would have done it anyway. Yeah. England were very lucky with them when the rain fell in that game. I think it's the first game, really, his first test on an Australian pitch, where he proved to be the most economical and the most threatening bowler. And he was a left-arm spinner. And even Victor Trumper, in absolutely prime form, couldn't hit him around. I think that's probably all you need to say.
Now, after stepping down from Test cricket in 1930 at the grand age of 52, how did Wilfred spend his retirement?
Well, the short answer to that is he didn't retire first. He was offered a position at Harrow School, which has a curious kind of symmetry to it because George Hurst was the coach at Eton. So he went to Harrow School as coach. I think it's safe to say if there's anything that didn't work in Wilfred's life, it was his 7 years at Harrow. Why didn't it work? Wilfred, I think it's safe to say, was a wonderful coach as long as you really wanted to learn and you were serious about your cricket. He was an enormous help to any number of Yorkshire players. The obvious ones are Roy Kilner and Headley Verity. But also every player he came in touch with really said, Wilfred pointed this out, pointed that out, helped me with this, helped me with that, whether they were batsmen, fast bowlers, spin bowlers, whatever. But at Harrow, he found himself teaching children or young adults of 16, 17 who really just wanted to batter the ball around. I think a lot of them didn't really understand what he was saying because he had this gruff Yorkshire accent. They weren't really interested in going through drills and being. They just wanted to jump down the wicket and hit balls for 6. And yes. I think Wilfred found it all a bit tiresome, but he got paid pretty well for it, for doing 2.5, 3 months work every summer term. And if they didn't learn anything from him, his attitude was, well, so what? I'm still getting paid. They'll go on and be successful lawyers or whatever. They're not going to be county cricketers. And I'm being well paid for this. And this is sorting me out for the whole year in 3 months. And eventually he was there for 6-7 years. And eventually there was a parting of ways. I think he made his feelings known to various members of the staff. George Hurst's at Eton was very different because George was joyful, fun. The kids loved him. It's an indication of their different characters. And then once he'd finished at Harrow in 1937, that was his retirement. And by then, eye problems had emerged and his eyesight did deteriorate over the next decade and a half.
You spoke earlier about Wilfred's bowling and batting exploits, both of which existed independently of one another. Was Wilfred an all-rounder, or was he a bowler, then a batsman, and then a bowler again?
That's a good one. I would say for the first 3 or 4 years of his career, he was a bowler who could bat a bit. He then became a bowling all-rounder for a few years. Then he became a batting all-rounder. Then he became just a batsman, pretty much, before the first war for 2 or 3 years. Just a batsman who could just bowl a bit. And then when he came back, he was really, maybe for a few years, he was a bowling all-rounder, and then he became a bowler who could bat a bit. So In answer to that, yeah, I don't think really. The statistics might show it slightly different. I think maybe there was a couple of years around about 1905, 1906, 7. You could say he was a genuine all rounder. You'd have said he was a slightly better bowler, but not by a huge degree. And I think that's true, possibly, of quite a lot of players who one perceives as all rounders. But then when you look at their records, you realise that actually their careers don't quite bear that out. Now, I'm not including, obviously, Gary Sobers. Or I remember looking at Mike Proctor's record in England, and it was very noticeable. The seasons where he got a lot of wickets, he didn't get many runs. And the season where he got a lot of runs, he didn't get many wickets. But Mike Proctor is always perceived as an all-rounder, and in many senses was in terms of his career. I think it's pretty tough to pull off both at the same level in the same season or in the same Test series. Wilfred will always be remembered mostly for his bowling, though. So I suppose over his entire career, you'd say he was a bowling all-rounder.
He lived to the grand old age of 95, dying in 1973, his blindness crippling his ability to watch his beloved cricket in the last few decades of his life. But he loved the game until the end, didn't he?
He did indeed. He went to cricket right up to, I think his last game was a one-day game involving Hampshire, which he watched with David Frith. He was at nearly all the Test matches in the 60s. He, as far as his eyesight was concerned, he basically lost all sight in the early. I'll try and get this right. Frank Worrell in the early 60s, his eyesight completely went, but certainly once his eyesight was gone, that didn't stop him going to cricket because he loved to go to grounds. People would say hello. He would sit there with George Hurst. I mean, I've said they weren't great mates, but they spent a fair bit of time together. And he loved the atmosphere of it. He tended to enjoy going most with either his daughter or his granddaughter, who would describe passages of play to him, and he could ask questions about what was going on. But he could follow a fair bit just by, I think possibly it's been slightly romanticized about how much he could follow of the game going on just by the sound of the bat on the ball or fielders running. I think that's been slightly overdone, but it is a wonderful story. But there is one which is true, which I got from, I can't remember who I got it from. He was watching a West Indies test, and Frank Worrell had been batting all day, I think, on the first day and scored 150, 160 not out or something. And on the second day, Worrell resumed his innings, and he was out after about 15 minutes. And Wilfred just turned to his neighbour, I can't remember who it was, and said, "I'm not surprised. I could tell he wasn't timing it properly." and that I do believe. And so that is an idea. When I say it's been slightly over romanticized that he knew everything that was going on without his eyesight, but that one about Frank Worrell, I thought was, and it is true. It's not apocryphal, and that's an indication of what he could and couldn't follow. And he always wanted to know about fielding positions. And he would have his own. Why has he got a man on the boundary? The point boundary. Why has that spinner got a man on the point boundary? I mean, does he know he's going to bowl short? Well, if he knows he's going to bowl short, he shouldn't be bowling.
Yeah.
And he got his when he was in his very later years. He was living with his daughter and son-in-law in south of England, Bournemouth, and he'd have his Yorkshire Post delivered a day late. and all the cricket reports, they would read the cricket reports to him. He would listen to the commentaries on the radio, commentaries of test matches on the radio. And also, I mean, I'm putting in things that Margaret, his granddaughter, told me at the time. He still busied himself around the house. There were certain jobs he could do that didn't require his eyesight. Vacuuming the stairs was one of them. Rolling newspaper up into tight little balls for lighting the fire. He would like doing. He did the washing up. I don't know how well he did the washing up if he was blind, but he would insist on doing it. And he would be out in the garden doing certain things. He was an active man. He wanted to be helpful. He didn't ruminate enormously on the past. He was always interested in what was going on in terms of of now, not just in terms of cricket by any means. Margaret said to me that her only real regret about those last years was that she and her brother didn't ask Wilfred more about the past and didn't. You had to prod him to get him to talk about himself or the past. He was more keen on talking about the present. He was a real technophile. He loved new inventions. He insisted on getting one of the first tumble dryers, and he was right up to date with any new invention, and he wanted to know all about them, and if he could afford it, get one for the family. And I think those little snippets that Margaret gave me were absolutely crucial in understanding what kind of man he was and what drove him, and what put, in modern parlance, what pushed his buttons. And I'm hugely grateful to Margaret for all the time and help she gave me and has given me. It really did make that was that was the icing on the cake, really. I pretty much finished the book when I first managed to get in contact with her. And that was the icing on the cake. I thought, now I really have written the definitive biography with her and with David Frith. Those two made me feel that, that's the job completed.
And finally, Patrick, this is a question I ask all my guests of their subject. What do you think Wilfred would have thought about the modern game?
Well, what aspects of the modern game? Goodness me, how much am I throwing my own perceptions onto it? I don't think he'd have thought a great deal about T20, but I do think that he would have rubbed his hands and thought, goodness me, look at all that money. I think he'd have been pretty good at it, not because of the kind of player he was, but because of his adaptability. And he would have, I'm going to say it again, he would have puzzled it out and made himself a good T20 player or a good ODI player. And he would have certainly approved of cricketers earning handsome wages. Of course, I think in terms of English cricket, he would have been very sad about the county championship and the way it's been culled to the degree it has. It's a really hard one, isn't it? But I think he would have coped with it a lot better than a lot of cricketers of that age, because he was adaptable, because he was forward-looking, and for those two reasons, really. It's hard to say, and I'm sure all your other guests would say much the same, but that's my answer to that one.
Well, Patrick, thank you for joining me to discuss the life and times of Wilfred Rhodes. Your biography from 2021, Wilfred Rhodes, The Triumphal Arch, is highly recommended. I really enjoyed it. I know you've written on other matters relating to the golden age of cricket, so perhaps we could have a chat again sometime soon.
Absolutely. This has been an enormous pleasure. It's probably gone on loads more than you thought it would. But I did tell you I like a natter, and Wilfred is one of my favourite subjects. I should just say that all through the book I've called him Rhodes, because I decided at the start, if I call him Wilfred, there's the danger of it just turning into a kind of praying at the altar of the great Wilfred, and I've really, really tried not to do that. I have tried to look at him in a warts and all kind of way. I didn't find many warts, I must say.
No, you've done an excellent job. Like I said, I can't recommend it highly enough. That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening. Remember to favourite or subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. My name is Tom Forward. Until next time, it's bye for now.